Let's talk about one of the weirdest food fights in American history. Seriously, it's a wild story about lobbying, some truly bizarre laws, and a battle over something you probably have in your fridge right now. This is the Great Margarine War.
And that brings us to the core question of this whole thing, and it sounds almost unbelievable. Did the United States Congress really have to pass two separate federal laws, decades apart, just to allow margarine to be yellow? Well, let's find out.
So our story kicks off way back in the late 19th century. This is where we see the very first piece of legislation that was designed to stop this new butter competitor right in its tracks.
Okay, so in 1886, Congress passes the Oleomargarine Act. Now, this law did two big things. First, it slammed a heavy tax on margarine to drive up the price. But the second part, that was the real stroke of genius, or, malice. It literally restricted manufacturers from coloring it yellow. And why? Because the powerful dairy industry was absolutely terrified of this new, cheaper spread that looked just like their butter.
This strategy was, you got to admit, brilliantly simple and super effective. If you can't beat them, make them ugly. The whole point of these color restrictions was to make margarine look as unappetizing as possible. The hope was that nobody would want to buy it no matter how cheap it got.
And the federal law? That was just the beginning. Some states took it even further. So while butter got to keep its natural, creamy yellow color, margarine was in a tough spot. To comply with all these anti-yellow laws, some states actually required it to be dyed these bizarre, gross colors. I mean, can you imagine trying to spread bright pink or even a muddy brown fat on your morning toast? For a lot of people, that was the reality.
So you might be wondering, if these laws were so unpopular, and frankly so weird, why on earth did they stay on the books for more than half a century? Well, the answer is kind of that classic mix of money, politics, and just plain old legal gridlock.
This really breaks down why things were stuck for so long. First, you had the dairy lobby, an absolute powerhouse in Washington, fighting tooth and nail to protect their industry. And their main strategy, these color restrictions, it was working perfectly to hurt margarine sales. But the real problem, the real hurdle, was that this wasn't just some small rule. It was federal law. And the only way to undo a federal law is to pass another one to repeal it.
And this timeline? Wow. It just really puts the sheer scale of this fight into perspective. From that first act in 1886, it took 64 years. 64 years of public frustration, of political battles, of intense lobbying, before Congress finally acted again in 1950. That's more than 2 entire generations living under a law that told them what color their food spread could be.
So after decades and decades of fighting, the tide finally started to turn. And the solution didn't come from a court case or a regulator. Nope, it came from a second corrective act of Congress.
And here it is, the Margarine Act of 1950. Its purpose was incredibly direct, to take apart the law that had been passed 64 years earlier. It officially got rid of the color restrictions and those heavy taxes, finally freeing margarine from its legislative prison and letting it be sold in its natural, butter-like yellow color.
All right, so after this 64-year war, let's circle all the way back to that question we asked at the very beginning.
The answer? Yes. Unequivocally yes. It sounds completely insane, but it is absolutely true. The United States federal government passed a law to ban yellow margarine, and then 64 years later had to pass a whole new law just to let it be yellow again.
So when you boil it all down, the takeaway is simple, but it's just astounding. It took 2 separate federal laws passed 64 years apart, all to decide the fate of a single color for a single food product. It's a perfect, if kind of bizarre, case study in the power of industry lobbying and just how hard it can be to get rid of a bad law.
And that leaves us with one last thought. This story might seem like a quirky, weird thing from the past, but the same forces are definitely still at play today. It really makes you wonder, what modern products or new technologies are caught up in their own version of yellow tape right now? Facing these crazy hurdles designed just to protect old industries from new competition. What's the margarine war of our time?